2:10 in the morning. Paris. Operators from the National Gendarmerie Intervention Group, known as GIGN, were already stacked outside a third-floor apartment door. This was not a standard counter-terrorism raid. The tactical video feed from their surveillance drones was experiencing an unexplainable latency, and the atmospheric pressure in the narrow hallway felt entirely wrong. Neither the police nor the heavily armed targets inside knew the physics of the room were about to change. The hallway was dark. The air smelled faintly of old copper. Alpha 1, the team leader, held his fist in the air. 5 men stood perfectly still behind him. Their heavy ballistic shields absorbed the minimal ambient light. Alpha 1 checked his wrist display. The time synchronization was drifting. It was off by 2 entire seconds. He lowered his hand and signaled his breacher. The breacher stepped forward. He placed a linear-shaped explosive charge against the reinforced steel hinges of the door. 3 miles away, the Tactical Operations Center monitored the assault team. The mission commander leaned over a digital blueprint of the building. The blue tracking markers representing his men were lagging. They froze for microseconds at a time across the monitor. The encrypted communication network hummed with a low-grade static. The technical officer typed rapidly on his keyboard. He attempted to clear the interference. The static remained constant. It sounded like heavy rain on a metal roof. The commander ignored the glitch. He focused strictly on the breach timing. Inside the apartment, the target cell leader sat wide awake. He did not hear the tactical team outside, but he felt a sudden and strange vibration in his teeth. A deep hum resonated through the concrete floor of the building. He reached for his modern Kalashnikov rifle resting on the wooden table. The metal of the weapon receiver felt unusually warm against his palm. He pulled the charging handle back. He chambered a single round of ammunition. The mechanical click sounded strangely muffled. 2:12 in the morning. The cell leader stood up. He raised 2 fingers. He signaled to his 3 men resting in the adjacent room. They woke instantly. They were experienced combatants. They moved without speaking a single word. They picked up their rifles and took designated defensive angles behind the load-bearing concrete pillars. The cell leader watched the main door. He raised his rifle. He looked through his electronic optic sight. The red aiming dot flickered once and died completely. He tapped the side of the optic. The red dot returned. It was noticeably weak. 2:14 in the morning. The hallway remained completely still. Alpha 1 tapped the breacher on the shoulder. He gave the final standby signal. The breacher gripped the remote detonator. He flipped the physical safety cover open. The armed indicator light blinked green, but it blinked completely out of its normal rhythm. It was a slight and erratic flicker. The breacher ignored the anomaly. Decades of strict training took over. He braced himself against the concrete wall. The operations center broadcast a final update over the radio network. The voice of the controller cracked heavily through the earpieces of the assault team. Alpha Team, you have a green light for execution. Target building is isolated. Acknowledge. Alpha copies. Executing in 10 seconds. The breacher wrapped his fingers around the firing trigger. Inside the room, the cell leader leveled his weapon at the center of the door. Both men waited for the violence to begin. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. In the third-floor hallway, the breacher depressed the detonator trigger. The shaped charge failed to sever the steel hinges, producing only a dull and heavy thud through the corridor. A thick cloud of gray dust plumed outward from the door without any concussive shockwave. Alpha 1 kept his weapon raised and stepped toward the thick smoke. The heavy reinforced door sagged at a harsh angle, leaving a 6-inch gap as the bottom hinges remained anchored. Alpha 1 spoke into his throat microphone, reporting the explosive breach failed and transitioning to manual. The mission commander replied immediately over the radio to proceed with the manual breach. Inside the apartment, the cell leader lowered his rifle slightly, expecting a blinding flash and pressure. Instead, a trickle of gray dust spilled through the fractured doorframe as the room's air grew colder. He blinked hard as the dust particles drifted in the dim light in slow motion, defying standard gravity. He looked at his second-in-command, who was positioned defensively behind a heavy kitchen island. The younger man shook his head and gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles completely white against the black polymer. The cell leader spoke softly to his team, ordering them to hold their angles and wait for the gap. In the hallway, the breacher slung his weapon across his chest and pulled a heavy steel pry bar. He stepped up to the sagging door and wedged the forged steel tip into the gap above the hinge. He drove his entire body weight backward, snapping the metal hinge with a sharp crack. He moved to the bottom hinge and repeated the motion until it tore free from the concrete frame. As the heavy door fell inward, hitting the floor, Alpha 1 tapped the shield bearer's shoulder to go. The point man stepped heavily into the fatal funnel of the doorway, carrying a massive 40-pound ballistic shield. Moving with trained aggression, his momentum dropped suddenly and unnaturally as his boots crossed the threshold. He pushed forward against incredibly dense air resistance, feeling like he was walking through waist-deep water. Behind him, Alpha 1 crossed the threshold into the exact same resistance as a low hum vibrated inside his helmet. With the hum coming from the air itself, the cell leader inside the room raised his Kalashnikov. He aimed directly at the entering ballistic shield, but the heavy rifle felt incredibly sluggish in his hands. He placed his finger on the trigger and prepared to fire as the true anomaly began. 2:18 in the morning. Inside the main room, the air was thick. The GIGN point man shoved his heavy ballistic shield forward. Every step required maximum physical exertion. The gray dust from the breech door hung perfectly suspended in the air. It did not settle. It drifted in slow and unnatural geometric patterns. Alpha 1 moved in directly behind the shield. His primary weapon was raised. His tactical light cut through the floating dust. The beam of brilliant white light looked fractured. It bent slightly as it crossed the room. It illuminated a heavy wooden table and a destroyed couch. He scanned the far corners of the apartment. He saw sudden movement behind a load-bearing concrete pillar. He spoke into his throat microphone. Contact front. 2 armed suspects. The response from the command center was completely unreadable. A heavy and rhythmic static filled his earpiece. It pulsed in perfect time with the deep vibration in the concrete floor. Alpha 1 tapped his radio housing. The static only grew louder. It drowned out all standard communication. He was entirely cut off from the outside world. 2:19 in the morning. Behind the kitchen island, the cell leader watched the blinding tactical lights sweep across the plaster walls. He raised his rifle. He aligned his iron sights on the center mass of the second operator. The police operator was partially exposed behind the heavy shield. The cell leader tried to adjust his footing. His heavy boots felt glued to the floorboards. The air pressure pushed against his chest like a physical wall. He looked to his right. His second in command was aiming his weapon. His hands were shaking violently. It was not from a sudden panic. The ambient vibration in the room was traveling up through the floor and into his muscles. It was an intense and localized frequency. The cell leader opened his mouth. He shouted a direct order to open fire. No sound came out. He tried again. He forced the air violently from his lungs. The command simply died in his throat. The acoustic properties of the room had fundamentally changed. Sound waves were being absorbed immediately into the heavy air. 2:20 in the morning. The center of the room. Alpha 1 realized he could not hear his own heavy footsteps. He could not hear the stressed breathing of his point man. The world had gone entirely silent. Only the rhythmic static in his encrypted earpiece remained. He removed his left hand from his rifle handguard. He gave standard tactical hand signals. He pointed 2 fingers at the kitchen island. He pointed a single finger at the concrete pillar. His men acknowledged with sharp and deliberate nods. They fanned out slowly across the room. The strange physical resistance in the air made sudden movements impossible. They moved like deep-sea divers walking across an ocean floor. Behind the concrete pillar, a third armed suspect stepped directly into the open. He held a compact submachine gun. He raised the barrel toward the GIGN point man. The distance between them was exactly 8 meters. Alpha 1 tracked the new target. He placed the glowing center of his holographic sight directly on the chest of the suspect. He moved his thumb. He flipped his fire selector switch from safe to semi-automatic. The mechanical click of the safety was completely silent. The cell leader saw the police officer shifting targets. He shifted his own aim back to Alpha 1. He tightened his grip on his Kalashnikov. The metal receiver was now uncomfortably hot against his bare hands. Both sides were locked into their final firing positions. The strict rules of engagement were fully met. The escalation phase was complete. Lethal force was now an absolute certainty. The standoff was perfect. It would break in seconds. 2:20 in the morning, in the Paris apartment, Alpha 1 stared through his holographic optic. The glowing reticle rested squarely on the chest of the third suspect. The man held a compact submachine gun. The distance between them was exactly 8 meters. The air in the room felt like a thick liquid. Every millimeter of movement required immense physical effort. 3 bright red laser beams cut through the frozen gray dust. They originated from the police weapons, painting solid red circles on the clothing of the 3 targets. The GIGN point man braced his heavy ballistic shield, planting his boots firmly on the wooden floorboards. He could not speak to his team, he could only act. He extended his heavy pistol around the right edge of his shield, aiming directly at the second suspect hiding behind the kitchen island. The rules of engagement were completely clear. Armed suspects actively aiming weapons at law enforcement personnel meant lethal force was fully authorized. There was no need for verbal warnings, which were physically impossible in the dead acoustic vacuum of the room. 2:21 in the morning, behind the kitchen island, the second suspect gripped his rifle tightly. His hands vibrated violently from the deep frequency pulsing through the floor. He saw the black muzzle of the police pistol pointed directly at his face, feeling a sharp spike of adrenaline. He stopped trying to shout to his leader and focused entirely on his front sight post. The cell leader tracked Alpha 1, who was partially exposed on the right flank of the formation. The cell leader aligned his iron sights with the center of the dark tactical vest. The metal of his Kalashnikov burned his bare hands with an unnatural heat, but he ignored the burning pain and squeezed the wooden pistol grip. He watched the red laser dot resting on his own chest. It did not waver, as the police operator was perfectly stable. The cell leader understood the tactical reality. He had to fire immediately. Alpha 1 saw the cell leader shift his weapon, seeing the dark hole of the rifle barrel point directly at his chest. He did not blink, his jaw tightening as his training dictated an immediate and lethal response. He applied pressure to the trigger of his primary weapon. The slack in the trigger disappeared, hitting the firm mechanical wall. The point man saw the second suspect lean out from the island and raise his weapon to eye level, prompting the point man to apply steady pressure to his pistol trigger. The third suspect stepped fully out from the concrete pillar, bracing his submachine gun against his shoulder and aiming directly at the center of the black ballistic shield. All 5 men were locked in a perfect lethal geometry with established angles and absolute intentions. The heavy air pressed down on their shoulders as the gray dust remained completely frozen in the intersecting beams of white light. Alpha 1 exhaled a slow and controlled breath, preparing for the violent recoil of his rifle, while the cell leader tightened his index finger. The breaking point had finally arrived. 2:21 in the morning, the Paris apartment. The standoff reached its absolute limit. 5 men stood frozen in the thick and vibrating air. The silence was complete. The atmospheric pressure pushed against their eardrums like a deep ocean dive. The gray dust hung perfectly still in the intersecting beams of white tactical light. Alpha 1 kept his right eye open behind his holographic sight. He focused squarely on the chest of the cell leader. He felt the heavy resistance of the air against his index finger. He began the final rearward press of his rifle trigger. The metal trigger shoe was cold. It moved with agonizing slowness. Every millimeter of travel required forced concentration. Across the room, the cell leader felt the exact opposite. His Kalashnikov rifle was burning hot. The heat radiated through the wooden handguard. It seared the bare skin of his palms. He ignored the intense pain. He focused entirely on the dark silhouette of the police operator. He applied steady pressure to his own curved metal trigger. His breathing stopped. The second suspect crouched low behind the kitchen island. He aimed at the GIGN point man. His hands shook violently from the low-frequency humming through the concrete floor. The red laser dot from the police pistol rested directly on his forehead. He did not blink. He tightened his grip on his rifle. The point man stood entirely exposed behind his heavy ballistic shield. The shield weighed over 40 pounds. In the dense air, it felt like 400. He locked his knees. He grounded his stance. He held his pistol firmly in his right hand. He aimed at the exposed head of the second suspect. He pulled the slack out of his pistol trigger. The internal safety plunger disengaged. The metallic sear engaged the striker. 2:21 and 40 seconds in the morning. Alpha 1 watched a single drop of sweat fall from the chin of the cell leader. The drop of water did not fall straight down. It drifted sideways. It floated slowly through the beam of a tactical flashlight. The laws of local gravity were actively unraveling. Alpha 1 did not break his visual focus. He maintained his lethal aim. He relied purely on his training. The third suspect stood completely in the open. He held his compact submachine gun tightly against his shoulder. He aimed directly at the center of the black shield. He opened his mouth wide. He screamed a violent battle cry. The sound never left his throat. The acoustic vacuum swallowed his voice entirely. His face twisted in deep frustration. He jammed his finger harshly against the trigger of his weapon. Alpha 1 pushed through the unnatural physical resistance of the air. His rifle trigger reached the final mechanical wall. The cell leader felt the searing heat of his weapon reach his finger. He pulled his trigger backward. The point man locked his wrist. He applied the final pound of pressure to his pistol. The second suspect jerked his finger backward in a sudden panic. 2:22 in the morning, the exact same microsecond. 5 highly trained men made the ultimate lethal decision. They were separated by 8 meters of impossible space. They acted completely simultaneously. There was no hesitation from either side. The escalation phase was officially over. The crisis had peaked. Alpha 1 pulled his trigger. The cell leader pulled his trigger. The point man fired. The suspects fired. 5 mechanical firing pins were released into the absolute silence. Heavy steel springs decompressed instantly. The firing pins drove forward with lethal intent. They struck 5 separate brass ammunition primers. The explosive chain reaction was initiated. The violence was finally set into motion. 2:22 in the morning. The Paris apartment. The triggers broke. 5 firing pins released. Heavy steel springs drove them forward. The mechanical actions were flawless. The steel pins struck the brass primers. The impact dented the soft metal. The chemical reaction was supposed to be instantaneous. A microscopic explosion inside the cartridge. The ignition of gunpowder. The expansion of lethal gas. The violent expulsion of a lead projectile. None of it happened. Alpha 1 felt the dull click through his thick tactical gloves. His rifle jumped slightly from the spring tension. No recoil followed. No muzzle flash illuminated the gray dust. His primary weapon was completely dead. He did not panic. Malfunctions happen in combat. His brain processed the physical feedback immediately. Tap, rack, reassess. That was the standard tactical protocol. Across the room, the cell leader felt the exact same dull mechanical thump. His violently hot Kalashnikov bucked slightly in his hands. The heavy bolt carrier did not cycle. The weapon did not fire. The searing heat of the metal remained, but the chamber was entirely inert. He stared at the black rifle in his hands. He pulled the heavy charging handle to the rear. He ejected the unfired ammunition cartridge. It spun slowly through the thick air. It hit the wooden floorboard. It bounced with agonizing slowness. 2:22 and 10 seconds in the morning, the point man experienced the exact same failure. His heavy pistol clicked weakly. He immediately tilted the weapon. He racked the slide. A live round tumbled out of the ejection port. It floated downward. He chambered a fresh round. He aimed at the second suspect. He pulled the trigger again. Another dull click. Another failure to ignite. The second suspect stood frozen behind the kitchen island. He pulled the trigger of his rifle a second time, then a third. He pulled it a fourth time. His finger moved in a frantic rhythm. Click, click, click. The weapon was a useless piece of hot metal. The third suspect stepped backward. He stared at his submachine gun. He slapped the side of the receiver. He pulled the charging handle. He aimed at Alpha 1. He squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. The primer simply would not ignite. 2:22 and 20 seconds in the morning. Alpha 1 let his primary rifle drop. It hung heavily on his tactical sling. He reached down to his right thigh. He drew his secondary pistol. He raised it in a smooth arc. He aimed at the cell leader. He pulled the pistol trigger. The internal striker fell. Another dead click. The cell leader watched the police operator draw the pistol. He watched the pistol fail. The cell leader did not reach for his own secondary weapon. He understood it was completely pointless. Every weapon in the room had suffered a catastrophic failure. It was not a mechanical jam. The physical components worked perfectly. The basic laws of chemistry were no longer functioning inside the apartment. Gunpowder would not burn. Primers would not spark. 2:22 and 30 seconds in the morning. The cell leader lowered his weapon entirely. He locked eyes with Alpha 1 across the floating gray dust. Both men realized the exact same terrifying truth. It was not a coincidence. It was a localized physical impossibility. The violence had been artificially paused. The laser sights on the police weapons began to flicker. The red beams dimmed. They pulsed in perfect time with the deep vibration in the concrete floor. Neither side had an advantage. Neither side could escalate. They were trapped together in an absolute vacuum of sound and kinetic energy. The air grew even heavier. The deep vibration intensified until it rattled their teeth. 2:23 in the morning, in the Paris apartment, the deep vibration in the concrete floor reached a sudden and violent peak. It rattled the tactical helmets of the police operators and shook the plaster from the ceiling before the vibration stopped completely. The sudden absence of the hum was more jarring than the noise itself. The brilliant white beams of the police tactical lights flickered rapidly. They dimmed to a dull yellow and then died entirely, plunging the room into near absolute darkness. Only the faint amber glow of a distant street lamp filtered through the shattered front window. The red laser sights on the police weapons faded out completely. Normal gravity returned to the room as the suspended gray dust collapsed to the wooden floor in a heavy wave. Alpha 1 stood in the dark, lowered his useless pistol, and breathed in deeply. The smell of old copper was entirely gone, and he reached to his chest rig to pull a standard chemical light stick. He bent the plastic tube until the inner glass vial snapped, shaking it violently. It produced only a pathetic and sickly green glow, providing almost no illumination, as even basic chemical luminescence was severely suppressed. Across the room, the cell leader gasped for air as sound returned to the space, his heavy breathing echoing loudly. He looked down at his hands, noting the skin on his palms was blistered red. His Kalashnikov had cooled instantly when the vibration stopped, so he let go of the black rifle. It fell from his hands and hit the floorboards with a loud and sharp wooden crack. The second suspect behind the kitchen island stood up slowly and dropped his rifle onto the granite countertop. The harsh metallic clatter made the police operators flinch as the suspect backed away slowly, raising empty hands. Trembling violently, he stared at the dark ceiling of the apartment, completely broken. The third suspect dropped his submachine gun, letting it hit the floor and bounce. He fell to his knees and placed his hands flat on the back of his head. He did not look at the police, looking instead at the floor in absolute terror. 2:24 in the morning, Alpha 1 reached for his throat microphone, pressed the transmit button, and spoke in a harsh whisper. "Command, this is Alpha 1. Do you copy?" There was no static or white noise. The earpiece was completely dead, its electronic components permanently fried. The GIGN point man lowered his heavy shield to the floor as the physical exertion caught up to him. He drew heavy plastic restraints from his belt and looked at Alpha 1, who nodded once. The police team moved forward in the dim ambient light, knowing their weapons were completely useless. They approached the three surrendered suspects, who did not resist or speak. The kill zone was entirely paralyzed, the violence erased by an invisible force. 2:25 in the morning, in the Paris apartment, the GIGN point man holstered his useless pistol. He pulled a thick plastic restraint from his tactical vest. He approached the second suspect behind the kitchen island. The young man did not move, keeping his hands raised high in the dim light. His chest heaved with rapid breaths as the point man grabbed his wrists, securing the heavy plastic strip with a loud zip. Across the room, Alpha 1 stood over the cell leader as the primary target knelt on the wooden floorboards. He stared blankly at his blistered palms before Alpha 1 kicked the dropped Kalashnikov away. The rifle slid across the floor, hitting the plaster wall with a dull thud. Alpha 1 secured the hands of the cell leader, who offered absolutely zero physical resistance and simply stared at the floor. 2:27 in the morning. Alpha 1 knelt beside the discarded rifle and picked up the unfired ammunition cartridge from the floor. He held it close to his face, the ambient light from the street illuminating the perfectly intact brass casing. He examined the bottom of the cartridge. The metallic primer bore a deep and unmistakable indentation. The heavy firing pin of the weapon had struck it perfectly. The laws of chemistry had simply refused to comply. He placed the dead cartridge into his zippered pouch and looked around the dark room. 3 highly dangerous men were fully secured with 0 shots fired and 0 casualties sustained. The tactical victory was absolute, but the reality of the room was deeply unsettling. They had not won the engagement, something else had simply paused it. 2:28 in the morning, Alpha 1 tapped the side of his helmet and pointed 2 fingers toward the hallway. His men understood the hand signal instantly, hauling the 3 secured suspects to their feet. The suspects moved sluggishly, keeping their heads down and completely avoiding looking at the dark corners of the apartment. They wanted to leave the space just as badly as the police team. The point man picked up his heavy ballistic shield, leading the procession toward the fractured doorway. The gray dust was now completely settled on the floor. The air felt normal again, but the absolute silence of their communication network remained a heavy burden. 2:30 in the morning, in the 3rd floor hallway, the point man stepped over the broken door frame and crossed the threshold into the narrow corridor. Alpha 1 followed closely behind, pushing the cell leader forward by his shoulder. The exact moment Alpha 1 stepped into the hallway, his earpiece screamed to life. A deafening burst of static hit his eardrum, causing him to wince sharply. Then the clear voice of the mission commander flooded the channel. "Alpha Team, this is command. We lost all telemetry. Report your status immediately." Alpha 1 keyed his throat microphone and looked back at the dark threshold of the apartment. "Command, this is Alpha 1. The suspects are secure. We are extracting." The mission commander responded quickly. "Copy secure. Did you engage?" Alpha 1 paused, searching for the correct tactical terminology, but there was none. He looked at the blistered hands of the terrorist leader, then at his own dead rifle. "Negative. No shots fired. Send the armorers to the debriefing. We have a total systemic anomaly." 5 in the morning, the Tactical Operations Center. The debriefing room was bright and entirely sterile. Alpha 1 sat across a heavy metal table from 2 master armorers. He placed his unfired ammunition cartridge onto the steel surface. The armorers carefully disassembled his primary rifle. They removed the bolt carrier group. They inspected the heavy firing pin under a bright magnifying light. They found absolutely 0 mechanical defects. The spring tension was perfect. They repeated the exact same process with the captured Kalashnikov. The result was completely identical. The enemy weapon was in perfect working order. The armorers examined the unfired brass cartridges from both sides of the conflict. The metallic primers bore deep and undeniable indentations. The firing pins had struck them with exact and lethal force. The chemical ignition of the gunpowder simply refused to happen. The master armorers exchanged confused looks. They had no technical explanation for the failure. The basic laws of chemistry had been temporarily suspended. 3 days later, a secure intelligence vault beneath the Ministry of Defense. Senior intelligence analysts reviewed the corrupted drone telemetry. They analyzed the sudden and extreme drop in atmospheric pressure. They measured the synchronized failure of the encrypted tactical radios. The technical officers discovered a highly localized spatial anomaly. It had perfectly encompassed the specific dimensions of the 3rd floor apartment. The acoustic data was the most deeply unsettling. The analysts isolated the audio feeds from the exterior hallway. The explosive breaching charge had registered as a dull thud. Inside the room, the audio feed was completely zeroed. The anomaly had actively suppressed chemical combustion and kinetic energy. It had also completely absorbed all sound waves. The captured targets were interrogated at a classified black site. The terrorist cell leader did not speak about his violent ideology. He did not boast about his failed mission. He only spoke about the terrifying and absolute silence. He described the unbearable heat of his rifle receiver. He described the heavy and dense air that trapped him physically in place. His hands were still wrapped in thick white bandages from the severe friction burns. Alpha 1 and his police operators reported the exact same physical sensations. Both sides of the deadly conflict had experienced the exact same unexplainable phenomenon. A final strategic assessment was officially drafted. It was heavily classified. It was distributed only to the highest levels of military and political command. The document contained no actionable tactical intelligence. It offered no strategic countermeasures. It contained only a profound and chilling warning. The morning sun rose over Paris. The city streets returned to their normal rhythm. But inside the secure intelligence briefing rooms, nothing felt normal again. The most advanced weapons and the most aggressive human intentions had been neutralized instantly. Both sides learned the exact same terrifying truth. Human warfare is entirely dependent on the strict physical laws of the universe, and those fundamental laws had been temporarily rewritten by something entirely unknown. The deadly violence was caused by a force neither side could possibly control, and whatever intervened in that dark apartment is not finished.